Tonight on Nova, the Russian right stuff. The deepest secrets of the Soviet space program can finally be told. How the cosmonauts tried and failed to land on the moon. Once clear leaders in the space race, a string of disasters set them back years. After the moon program collapsed, they tried to hide all the evidence. The story of this Soviet defeat is the dark side of the moon.
Funding for NOVA is provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. And Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
When President Kennedy laid down this challenge, the Soviet Union already had secret plans to land a man on the moon. They spent billions of rubles on this race. Yet for over 2 decades, they pretended their program did not exist. It is the biggest cover-up in the history of space travel. If the Soviet lunar program had been successful, this man might have taken the first step on the moon. Alexei Leonov was one of 3 cosmonauts selected to pilot the Soviet lunar landing craft. There was a total of 9 cosmonauts in the program. Some, like Leonov, were training to land on the moon. Others were preparing to fly around it. They were not allowed to discuss these plans outside their closed group. Until recently, it has remained a forbidden subject. Today, for the first time, General Leonov agreed to describe his secret mission.
Main antenna. In Russian versions, we have only one man which landed to the moon. And the step лестница как. This is a position cosmonaut. He can see through this window and select place for landing on the moon. He had about 25 seconds for selecting.
In 1959, the Soviet Union established an early lead in the race by launching several unmanned rockets towards the moon. They successfully crash-landed an object on its surface, and then flew another probe behind the moon. It sent back pictures of the far side, which had never been seen before. In 1963, Premier Khrushchev was basking in the reflected glory of the cosmonauts. Their space flights had been a great political triumph. The Soviet Union had just scored a double first, with the first woman as well as the first man in space. And Khrushchev wanted more. The American astronauts put on a brave face, but they had taken second place every time. They never knew what to expect next. Whenever NASA thought it was narrowing the gap, the Soviets would strike again. The early single-seat spaceships had served their purpose. Both sides had orbited the Earth, and both were now gearing up for the next round with bigger capsules and rockets on the drawing board. Korolyov, the chief designer behind the Soviet space program, was now developing his strategy to put a man on the moon. A new giant rocket would have to be built, big enough to carry a lander and command module to the moon. Korolyov would have to fight great battles over the design of this rocket and what fuel it should use. Once in lunar orbit, it was planned that a cosmonaut would make a spacewalk from the command module to the lander, which was folded up inside the lower stage. Blasting the lander free, this cosmonaut would begin his descent to the moon, while his partner remained in orbit. The Soviets knew it would be safer to land 2 men, as the Americans were planning to do. But the Soviet rocket would not be able to carry the extra weight. After a few hours on the surface, the cosmonaut would return to the command module for the journey back to Earth. But the moon landing was years away, and the chief designer faced a more immediate challenge. He knew that NASA had plans to launch a 2-seat spacecraft called Gemini, which would allow astronauts to rendezvous in orbit and perform spacewalks. Korolyov had a 3-man spaceship on the drawing board. This craft, called Soyuz, was a brilliantly adaptable design, which could be used for the moon missions and link-ups in space, but it would not be ready in time to beat Gemini. To satisfy Khrushchev's demands, Korolyov hatched a desperate plan: to convert the old single-seat Vostok, which had taken Gagarin and the other cosmonauts to space, into a 3-seater. Many of the engineers rebelled because safety would have to be sacrificed in order to stay ahead of the Americans. Konstantin Feoktistov, one of Korolyov's most talented designers, was at the center of this protest. He was also an outspoken critic of the moon program. Korolyov's devious plan to rid himself of a troublemaker was a masterstroke. He knew that Feoktistov wanted to travel to space himself.
К вопросу о том, чтобы посмотреть, нельзя ли...
The question of sending 3 men on the Vostok came up many times. Each time we argued that it would be unsafe, that it would be better to be patient and wait for the Soyuz spaceship to be built. This craft would take 2 or 3 people and would have sophisticated safety systems.
Но он все-таки нас добил.
In the end, of course, he got his way. In February 1964, he outwitted us. He said that if we could build a ship based on the Vostok design, which would carry 3 people, then one of those places would be offered to an engineer. Well, this was a very seductive offer. And a few days later, we produced some rough sketches. Our first ideas were accepted. We unveiled our plans for this new ship in March or April. It became known as the Voskhod.
To adapt the old Vostok, the ejection seat and control systems had to be removed. 3 seats were then installed. It would be too cramped for spacesuits. Tracksuits would have to do. In an emergency, escape would be impossible.
As for safety, I would say it was totally ignored.
Well, why was that?
I wish I knew.
Are you saying the flight wasn't safe?
It was far from safe.
Even though he knew the risks better than anyone else, Feoktistov donned his flying helmet to become the first engineer to venture into space. On October 12, 1964, the intrepid three-man crew squeezed into the pod and were ready for blastoff.
Our rocket engines developed about 10 million horsepower. If you think of one person riding a horse, in our case it was as if we were riding 10 million horses. It was a tremendous feeling, particularly the physical effects on the body, the noise, the atmosphere. The experience of liftoff is one of the most powerful feelings of a spaceflight.
In 24 hours, they flew 16 orbits round the Earth. The gamble had paid off. It was another blow to American morale. James Oberg, a NASA mission controller and Soviet space analyst, recalls how easy it was to jump to the wrong conclusions.
Now, the 3 men in the capsule was another major Soviet success, a major space spectacular. And at the time, Western observers didn't appreciate how much of a sham it really was. To them, it was an Apollo-type mission flown before even our first Gemini flight. It was very depressing and very successful from the Soviet propaganda point of view.
Only those inside the Soviet Design Bureau knew the truth.
The program made no contribution whatsoever to the further development of space research. It was simply a waste of time. Sending 3 people into space together was done purely for prestige.
On the day the 3 cosmonauts returned from space, Brezhnev ousted Khrushchev. This political change would have a profound effect on the future of the space program. Different design chiefs lobbied for power, and destructive arguments about the design of the moon rocket intensified. The designers who lived through those bitter years are only now willing to discuss the moon battles. Korolyov's deputy, Vasily Mishin, would be destroyed by these rivalries. He has pictures of the secret N1 moon rocket, which are still classified, but he did agree to draw it instead.
It was a heavy 3-stage rocket. It had 30 engines, each developing 150 tons of thrust. It would carry payloads of up to 92 to 95 tons. So it was clear that we wouldn't be able to send 3 people up. The Americans had their launch pad at Cape Canaveral, which was geographically far more favorable than we had at Baikonur. Because of the rotation of the Earth, when they launched towards the east, their rockets developed greater speed than ours. Also, from the very beginning, theirs was a fully integrated national program. But the main thing they did was to create a very good nerve center, NASA.
NASA was beginning to take the lead. While it was successfully enlisting dozens of corporations to build the Saturn moon rocket, the rival Soviet Design Bureau were fighting over who should build what. They argued about the size of the engines and what kind of fuels to use. Korolyov's original rocket was fueled with liquid oxygen and kerosene. For the N1 moon rocket, his engine designer wanted to use some new, dangerously corrosive fuels. After an angry showdown, he left Korolyov to work on a smaller rocket called Proton. This disastrous split meant that an aircraft designer with no knowledge of rockets had to take over the giant N1. It was a plumber's nightmare, with miles of piping feeding its 30 engines. While the engineers set to work, the chief designer had another surprise up his sleeve. To get to the moon, they would need to develop a new technique. spacewalking. Korolyov chose Alexei Leonov for the job.
He told me, put on a spacesuit and see whether it's possible for a human being to walk in space. Earlier, he said the famous words, just as a sailor on board an ocean liner must know how to swim, so a cosmonaut on a spaceship must know how to swim in open space.
For the cosmonaut to leave the ship, they designed a flexible airlock, which looked rather like a shower curtain. Voskhod 2 was similar to Voskhod 1, except it only had 2 seats in order to accommodate spacesuits and to give the spacewalker enough room to maneuver into the airlock. Once inside, he would shut the inner hatch and open the outer. It was ingenious, but not easy to use, as Leonov would discover. Climbing in and out was a struggle. The success of the moon missions depended on being able to perform a spacewalk with a self-contained air supply.
The first time I put on a spacesuit, I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. There were many problems that had to be resolved. Problems with the airlock, which had to be compact, but also easy to use. Then the problems with the spacesuit and the life support system. This backpack weighed 36 kilos. The air pressure inside was 300 atmospheres. 300 atmospheres. Yet, you had to be able to carry it like a normal backpack. It was March the 18th. It was snowing that morning at the Cosmodrome, which was unusual for Kazakhstan. We put on our spacesuits and went out to the rocket. Sergei Pavlovich came up to me, shook my hand, and said he hoped everything would go according to plan, and wished me a sunny wind.
I opened the door, space door, and I saw sky, very black sky, many stars, blue stars, big stars, very brightly sun, very quiet, очень тихо. Было очень тихо. I heard my heart and дыхание and breathing and breathing.
It was an extraordinary sensation. I had never felt quite like it before. I was free above the planet Earth, and I saw it, so it was rotating majestically below me. Suddenly, in the silence, I heard the words, "Attention, attention, man has entered open space."
He floated in space for 10 minutes and would spend the next 12 trying to get back in.
I couldn't get back in straight away. My spacesuit had ballooned out, and the pressure was quite considerable. I was tired and couldn't go in feet first, as I had been taught to do. But using a valve down here, I decreased. Where is the valve here? I decreased the pressure to just under 0.27 atmospheres. Then I felt freer and I could move about more easily. Then I pushed myself into the airlock, head first, with my arms holding the rails. Holding the rails. I had to turn myself upside down in the airlock in order to enter the ship feet first. And this was very difficult.
Leonov was lucky to escape with his life. He very nearly ran out of air in his struggle to re-enter the airlock. And by releasing the pressure in his bloated spacesuit, he also risked an attack of the bends. The return to Earth was just as traumatic. The automatic navigation system failed. So, with Yuri Gagarin talking them down, they had to land the craft manually. During re-entry, the aerials burned off. The crew had no way of communicating with mission control. In fact, they were 1,000 miles off course and had to be rescued from a forest. They returned triumphant in the knowledge that a successful spacewalk had been achieved months before the Americans. Korolev welcomed back another hero of the Soviet Union, knowing how crucial this latest triumph was to the moon program. By the mid-60s, the Soviet manned lunar program was well underway. Yet in this Moscow museum, there's nothing to suggest the existence of their most ambitious space endeavor. Only the hardware from their successful unmanned lunar probes is on display.
Before 1966, nobody knew what is the lunar surface like. Some scientists said that it is like stone. Some scientists said that it is very deep dust layer, maybe 3 meters. And we must design our aperture very good to all these surfaces.
Georgy Grechko helped to design a bouncing probe capable of settling on any kind of lunar terrain.
This big ball disappeared, and this small fall on the moon surface. Then these devices slowly go in this position to send the signal to the Earth.
And could you tell us what happened to the pictures from the moon?
Maybe it was not so good for us, but the truth is truth, and glasnost to glasnost. We had in that time a very big bureaucratic system, and when we have the snaps from the moon surface in our bureau, we give it for some small boss. The small boss give it for not so big boss, and then to big boss, to biggest, and this way was very long.
At the Jodrell Bank radio telescope in England, Sir Bernard Lovell started picking up some strange signals. Using a newspaper facsimile machine, he was able to decode the picture. So the first pictures from the moon's surface were published not in Pravda, but in the Daily Express. Korolev never saw them. He died on the operating table at the age of 59. During his lifetime, he had been considered so important to the Soviet Union that officially he had never existed. Now that he was dead, he could receive the highest accolade, burial in the Kremlin wall.
For me, Koryov was the best scientist, the best designer, the best chief, the best man. When he was a chef of this designer bureau, we always were ahead of our American colleagues. Of course, one genius is much better than 1,000, maybe like me.
His successor would have to face some intractable problems. The battle lines between the rival design groups were more entrenched than ever. The man who took over was Korolyov's deputy, Vasily Mishin. He inherited a moon program that had lost years of development because of political infighting over the N-1 moon rocket. But at last, the long-awaited Soyuz spacecraft, another vital part of the moon project, was ready to fly. This spaceship would be used for all future manned missions. The man selected for the maiden flight was Vladimir Komarov, who had commanded the dangerous three-man-in-a-pod mission.
Komarov was a really good friend of mine, and a man I trusted totally. He had both a pilot's training and a degree in engineering, so it was only natural that he should be chosen to test the Soyuz.
After Soyuz 1 was launched, it ran into problems as soon as it reached orbit. One of the solar panels did not unfold, so the ship's power supplies were too low. The planned rendezvous with the second Soyuz was canceled, and Komarov was ordered home. The landing capsule separated, and he began his re-entry. He was slightly off course and spinning as he entered the atmosphere. To break the capsule on its descent to Earth, a drogue parachute was released, but the main chute became jammed. A backup was deployed, and because the capsule was spinning, the two chutes became tangled.
He didn't hear the main parachute burst open. He didn't feel it. He wasn't aware of the tangle. Of course, he should have stabilized the craft with a backup chute because he knew that it was spinning, but it wasn't spinning that fast. The capsule hit the ground at tremendous speed, and Komarov died.
Komarov's fatal mission was the first under the new chief designer. This tragedy would set back the Soyuz program over a year. Gagarin, who was Komarov's backup on the mission, paid tribute.
Мы ценим его как человека нового общества, пламенного патриота, офицера-коммуниста, воспитанного Ленинской партией, замечательного товарища и верного боевого друга.
A year later, Gagarin himself was killed on a routine training exercise when his plane crashed in some woods. Leonov, who was an old friend of Gagarin, was asked to try to identify the shattered remains.
In Moscow, there is a hotel called the Unist, where for many years Yuri Gagarin and I used to have our hair cut. There was no barber in Star City, so on Saturday we used to go there together. Yuri was in the chair, having his hair cut, and I was watching very carefully. He had very beautifully shaped head, and there was a mole on the back of his neck. When the barber got out the razor to tidy up the back, I could see the mole, so I said, "Hey, don't cut the mole. I can see this mole." When they began to examine his remains, they showed me a part of Yuri Gagarin, the part of his head and neck, where was the mole. Up till then, I didn't want to believe that Yuri had died. But this mole that I had seen on the day before, this spot on the beautiful, strong, young body, I saw it amongst the remains. Yes, this is the mole of Yuri Gagarin.
The Soviet space program was now reeling from the death of its patron saint, Gagarin, its founding father, Korolev, and one of its best cosmonauts, Komarov. The moon seemed further away than ever.
The engines are on.
The Soviets knew the Americans were pulling ahead with their Apollo moon program, but NASA had little idea of what the cosmonauts were up to. Nikolai Rukavishnikov was training for a secret program which could steal back the lead. Since their medium-sized rocket Proton was ready, they could now reach lunar orbit. The mission was codenamed Zond.
The Zond spacecraft were designed to orbit the moon, not to land on it. It was designed to make a flight circling the moon. They were to be manned by two people, and as we always do in the Soviet Union, before sending a man into space, we launch several unmanned flights first.
The first unmanned Zond, having looped around the moon, made an unintentional splashdown in the Indian Ocean. Its navigation system had failed. But the cosmonauts were still hoping for a manned flight.
Before the launches, mistakes were made. Engineers put plus instead of minus. Engine systems were wrongly aligned. This was infuriating and actually caused the loss of a spaceship. But this would have never happened with a manned mission, and such missions could have gone ahead. But after the death of Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, the program suffered. There was no strong leader to carry it forward and stay a few steps ahead. I'm sure that if Korolev hadn't died, a Soviet cosmonaut would definitely have orbited the moon in 1968.
The grounded cosmonauts could only watch as Apollo 8 was launched. 2 weeks earlier, their own flight to circle the moon had been canceled.
I know my own impression is that it's a vast, lonely, forbidding type.
But the Soviets were still in the race. The giant N-1 rocket was just 2 months away from its first launch, and Leonov was training hard for a landing on the moon. He had to learn to fly a helicopter as if it was a lunar lander.
I made 9 very difficult landings in that helicopter, with the engines cut. Normally, pilots don't do such landings because they usually end in a catastrophe. But we did it. We, cosmonauts and pilots, perfected the art.
In the U.S., on a proving ground in Houston, Neil Armstrong was practicing for the same maneuver, and his experiences were no less traumatic. In February 1969, the N-1 moon rocket had its maiden flight from this pad. 70 seconds after liftoff, it caught fire and blew up. 6 months later, on its second launch, it exploded again, this time totally destroying the launch pad. The Soviet engineers now realized they were unlikely to land a man on the moon before the Americans, so they accelerated their unmanned program. This probe, called Luna 15, was designed to bring back rock samples from the moon's surface. Apollo 11 was launched 3 days after Luna 15. The astronauts were racing a robot to the moon.
Engines, all sources show the second stage is burning perfectly. 2 minutes, 51 seconds into the mission.
The Soviets had one more chance to get something to the moon first, ahead of Apollo, and that was the lander here, which was supposed to bring back the samples before the astronauts could do so. They launched one of those just shortly before Apollo 11. And as it reached the moon, as Apollo was circling the moon in July of 1969, waiting for the landing spot, this was also in orbit, the Luna 15, and it descended toward the moon and crashed right here, Moria Kryzizov, the Sea of Crises, just as we were landing on the Moria Spokojstviya, right here, successful on the Sea of Tranquility, right there. The Luna 15 marker, it's gone, they haven't even put it back.
Okay, all flight controllers, go. We're landing. Retro. Go. Righto. Go. Guidance. Go. Forward. Go. 4 forward, just into the right a little. 30. 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Forward, just 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. Straight shadow. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We've had shutdown. We copy you down, Eagle. It's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind.
It was greatest event in the world, I believe. Величайшее событие в мире было.
It was extremely interesting when we saw how Armstrong touched the surface of the moon with his foot. It was extremely interesting, especially when the television camera, which was installed on the Apollo lunar module, showed a bit of the moon's surface, the ladder, and Neil Armstrong's foot when he touched the moon.
So were you jealous?
Well, what can I say? They were our colleagues and they got there first. Someone had to get there first. The Americans may have been jealous of Gagarin's flight. Jealousy doesn't enter into it. It made me happy because it was a great achievement for mankind.
Our specialists in the Soviet Union were watching the outstanding American mission with great interest. However, the Russian people were only told about it much later. Several years later. Many years later.
What they did publicize was the success of their next unmanned lunar lander. But by the time Luna 16's robotic arm drilled into the moon's surface, 4 Apollo astronauts had brought back samples to America. To retrieve the Soviet moon dust, it was flicked into a canister and blasted back to Earth. It was a clever mission which enabled the Soviet Union to collect moon rock, even if it was only a few ounces. The Apollo astronauts would collect several hundred pounds. So although their precious moon dust was important scientifically, it had no propaganda value outside the Soviet Union. They were eager to prove they could explore the moon without man. Who needed cosmonauts anyway? Work began on a remote-controlled vehicle that could cope with any terrain. Looking rather like a Victorian perambulator, Lunicod would actually beat the American buggy to the moon. But the images from the later Apollo flights are the ones which stick. Who can forget the joyride of the century as the lunar buggy bounced over moon dunes?
Oh, this is going to be some kind of different ride.
Driving Lunicod was much less fun. It was controlled remotely from a lab in Moscow.
Первая вперед.
Nevertheless, it left the first wheel marks on the moon and trundled around for weeks, sending back thousands of pictures. It was proclaimed as a victory for unmanned space exploration.
I am a representative of the manned space program. So, obviously, I think it would have been much better to put the money spent on unmanned flights into manned flights.
By the end of the 60s, the only way forward for the manned program was to build space stations, which could be used as a base for long-duration missions. This was the beginning of a new era in the grand plan. In the early days, they investigated the possibility of creating artificial gravity. They hoped to counteract the potentially damaging effects of living in the weightless conditions of space.
Стрела летит не прямо, а по дуге. Земных космонавтов-испытателей регулярно навещает врач. Важно установить, как различные скорости вращения действуют на нервную систему человека.
Artificial gravity stations remained a dream of the future. A zero-gravity station would be much easier to construct. Konstantin Feoktistov was one of the engineers who pioneered orbital space stations. He led a powerful lobby which was opposed to spending any more on the ill-fated Moon project.
In the 1960s, it was clear to us engineers that the most important development for manned flights would be the creation of orbital space stations. But the administration was against it. Mission, the design bureau chief, was totally opposed to this. He thought that it was important to carry on with the Moon program. Everything else was nonsense and not worth doing. We didn't know how to get the bosses to change their minds. But some well-wishers in the party central committee cunningly inserted a passage into Brezhnev's speech, saying that orbital space stations promised the right way forward.
So by going behind his boss's back, Feoktistov achieved his goal. The first space station was named Salyut. It was designed to dock with the Soyuz spacecraft. It was ready for launch in 1971. Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Poltsayev would be the first crew to try living in space aboard the new station. They quickly adapted to life on board the station and carried out many experiments. Every night for 3 weeks, they entertained 100 million Soviet television viewers with their reports from the strange, weightless world of Salyut. Families throughout the land got to know these three men. It made the tragic end to this mission even more shocking. As they came back to Earth, all the air in their capsule drained out through a faulty valve. There were no spacesuits on board. The cosmonauts were dead before they reached the ground.
In such complicated areas of research as rocket systems and spaceflight technology, no one is immune from danger. In the case of Poltsayev, Volkov, and Dobrovolsky, they didn't know how to use the manual control system. So this is why the flight ended this way. They could hear the hiss of escaping air. They could have put a finger over the hole, and that would have done it.
The nation was stricken with grief. But the space station program went on. Scores of cosmonauts lived aboard their stations for months at a time without further mishap. They gathered a mass of data on how weightless conditions affect the human body. At the end of 1972, the American astronauts left the moon for the last time.
Ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector good.
What has never been revealed is that even after this, the Soviets planned to win back the lead by landing 3 men on the moon. Chief designer Mishin's secret plans would require 2 of the giant N-1 rockets, one for the crew and the other to carry a huge lunar lander. Once they were orbiting the moon, the final stages of the 2 rockets would dock, and the entire complex would make its descent to the moon's surface. The 3 cosmonauts would live for up to a month on the moon. If this went well, there were even plans to establish a lunar base. The top stage of the rocket was powerful enough to take them directly back to Earth. But first, they had to tame their unpredictable N-1 rocket. With its explosive history, 8 perfect launches would be needed before they could dare risk a crew. But the next N-1 blew up 7 seconds after launch. The one after that lasted 107 seconds, the best so far, but not good enough. It was the end of the moon program. James Oberg traveled down to the Baikonur Cosmodrome where the moon rocket was launched. He hoped to find clues which would tell him more about the doomed giant. As soon as he set foot in the main town of Leninsk, Oberg started his search. He was looking for a section of the main fuel tank, which he had heard was being used as a roof over a bandstand, but no one seemed to know where it was. This drawing shows the huge hangar where the moon rocket was assembled, before being wheeled down to the pad. Today, the same building houses the massive Energia rocket that's used to carry the new Soviet shuttle. But until the mid-70s, this was where the N-1 rockets were prepared.
After the last one blew up, they had 6 more of them in all these halls ready for flight. At least 2 were flight ready, 4 were being assembled, and other pieces were all over this place. It was canceled. Now, all the spacecraft and rockets in this building were scrapped, torn apart. A couple pieces are outside somewhere, they wouldn't show them to us. But the rest of them were all scrapped and gone. But there are ghosts here. Somewhere the N-1 moon rocket. Someone remembers it.
We felt a deep sense of sadness. It was a colossal project to which we dedicated our best years. I was young at the time. And it was the work of a great many people, and it vanished overnight. The Americans had won. I was made the scapegoat.
Mishin was fired as chief designer. Since 1974, he has been a lecturer at the Moscow Aviation Institute. For over a year, we tried to persuade the Soviet authorities to show us the relics of their moon program. They finally agreed. and we were taken to an old hangar, a kind of space junkyard. Mishin gave us a guided tour of his original lunar hardware. This was the command module which might have flown around the moon. It's modeled on the Soyuz craft and has a hatch from which a cosmonaut would walk across open space to the lunar lander. If the N-1 rocket had worked, the legs of this lander might be resting where they belong, in moon dust.
The craft would land on 4 pads like this. These would sink into the surface of the moon. These shock absorbers would cushion any shock there might be on impact. The cosmonaut would get out through this special hatch onto this platform and use this ladder to get down onto the surface of the moon. After spending a little time on the surface, the cosmonaut would return to his craft.
No one in the West has ever seen inside the Soviet lunar lander. What secrets would it reveal? This was where the intrepid cosmonaut would stand, clutching 2 levers. It looked more like the inside of a steam train than a spaceship. Even allowing for the Spartan appearance of Soviet hardware, these systems looked surprisingly primitive.
If Korolev had lived, might the Soviet Union have put a man on the moon before the United States?
No. Not a chance. Of course, would have got further, but we wouldn't have got there before the Americans. You see, by the end of our moon program, we had spent 4 billion rubles altogether. But the Americans had spent over 25 billions. That speaks for itself.
Союз, начинаю ориентацию Аполлон.
I read you loud and clear. We have a go for docking.
In 1975, the cosmonauts and astronauts who had been racing to the moon finally came together to train for a joint mission, a link up in space.
Around X-axis and X, Y, Y.
The Apollo moon program was over, and all Soviet hopes of landing a man on the moon had been abandoned. So the Apollo-Soyuz mission was a great propaganda exercise for both sides. For the Soviet Union, it was a chance to regain some prestige. For the Americans, it used up their last Saturn rocket.
Есть стыковка.
The long-awaited handshake offered the hope that in space, people could transcend their earthly differences. Alexei Leonov and Tom Stafford were the mission commanders.
As old philosopher says, the best part of a good dinner is not what you eat, but with whom you eat.
From the late 70s onwards, the Soviet Union has concentrated its efforts in an area where they established an early lead, their long-term space station program. Some cosmonauts have logged over a year in space, so in theory, they are ready for a 2-year round trip to Mars. Perhaps, instead of racing to Mars, the Soviets and Americans could pool their knowledge and resources. It might be the only way to finance such an expensive journey. This would be popular with the astronauts and cosmonauts, but maybe it needs a race to move governments.
Знаете, каким он парнем был, на руках весь мир его носил. Сын земли и звезд не был и прост, людям свет как дан понес. Он сказал, поехали, он взмахнул рукой, словно вдаль по Питерской, пронесся над землей. Знаете, каким он парнем был, как на лед он с клюшкой выходил, как он песни пел весел, был и смел, как азартно жить хотел. Он сказал, поехали, он взмахнул рукой, словно вдаль по Питерской, несется над землей.
Funding for NOVA is provided by Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. And the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you. For a transcript of this program, send $5 to this address or call 212-227-READ.
This is PBS. Most NOVA programs are available on videocassette. Schools, businesses, and organizations interested in purchasing videocassettes should call 1-800-441-NOVA.